Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining tonight. If you'd like to take your seats, we're going to get started here. I appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to be here. Thank you so much. We're very pleased to welcome former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst, to Kansas City. My name is Evan Verplu, and I serve as Program Manager and Interim Director of the International Relations Council. Since 1955, we have served as a Kansas City-based nonprofit that seeks to educate the community about the international world through lectures, discussion groups, and cultural offerings. I would also like to make a special thanks to the Kansas City Public Library for partnering with us on this program and providing us this truly stunning space in which we find ourselves in tonight. I would also like to recognize our sponsors tonight who are integral in making this program happen. Thank you to the University of Kansas Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the Lawrence D. Starr Center for Peace and Justice at the University of St. Mary, the Kansas City Public Library, and Nancy C. Messer for your support tonight. I would now like to pass the mic over to Eric Scott, who serves as the Director for the KU Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, who will introduce our moderator and speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Evan, and thank you to the Kansas City Public Library for hosting us in this beautiful space, and to the International Relations Council of Kansas City. We are just over a year into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is hard to believe because February 24th, 2022 seems in some ways like it belongs to another age. Certainly many in the region and many watching its politics from afar we're not surprised by Russia's ambitions to dominate what its politicians call the quote-unquote near abroad. Russia, after all, went to war against Georgia in 2008. Russian-backed separatist forces in Ukraine in 2014 illegally annexed Crimea in 2014. More than a decade, Russia has been using hard and soft power to push back against Western influence in the region and in Russia itself. To be sure, the scale of Russia's invasion was shocking, but even more impressive has been the strength of Ukraine's resistance and the way the war has reshaped the world. Finland, after decades of studied neutrality, is now on the cusp of joining NATO. The EU and the US have gotten more involved in supporting Ukraine than one could have imagined before, although the level of support still might not be enough, whether in terms of weapons or in terms of support for Ukraine's bid to be an EU member. The war has also reverberated in our communities. KU is hosting a number of scholars and students at risk who are forced to flee from Ukraine, who are now a part of our community in Lawrence. KU's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, which I have the pleasure to direct, and is part of KU's new Institute for International and Global Engagement, is one of 12 federally designated national resource centers in the United States, and we've been a partner in these efforts, drawing on the resources we have, including our talented faculty. We are the only institution in the US besides Harvard that has 2 tenured specialists on Ukraine, including my colleague Vitaly Chernesky, who's here tonight. And we do what we can to educate the public on the war's historical, political, cultural, and economic context. Before I introduce our very esteemed speakers tonight, I want to mention 2 events that are on the horizon. Tomorrow, for those of you willing to make the trip to Lawrence, Oksana Kis, a specialist from the National Academy of Science of Ukraine, will be talking about Ukrainian women at war, both historically and in the current fight against Russia. That's tomorrow at 7 p.m. on the KU campus. On Sunday, we have a festive event, our annual Spring Festival at 4 p.m. There is free food, there are door prizes. Everyone is welcome to both events. They are free of charge, and I encourage you to learn more by visiting our website, crease.ku.edu. Follow us on Instagram at KU_Crease or on Facebook. Tonight, though, we are incredibly lucky, the IRC is incredibly lucky to have Ambassador John E. Herbst speaking to us, and it's really an honor to introduce him. And he has had such a long and distinguished career that I'm going to try to do it justice, but also cut it short because you're here to hear him. He is the Senior Director of Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, He was educated at Georgetown, Tufts, and Johns Hopkins, and served for 31 years as Foreign Service Officer of the U.S. Department of State. Among his postings was that of U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006 during the time of the Orange Revolution. He was also the U.S. Ambassador to Uzbekistan from 2000 to 2003 when he helped establish an American base to conduct Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. His last 4 years at the State Department were spent serving as a coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization, which are certainly important issues for Ukraine today and for Ukraine in the future when it ultimately has the chance to rebuild from this war. He has received numerous awards, including the Presidential Distinguished Service Award and the Secretary of State's Career Achievement Award. He is also a frequent commentator on television and radio. This is how I know his work and his comments on the current war in Ukraine from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and other major publications. We are also very lucky to have a wonderful moderator tonight in Mark Wilcox, who is a retired Army Intelligence Foreign Area Officer, who's now an associate professor in the Command General Staff College, Department of Joint Interagency and Multinational Operation. Mark has 25 years of active duty, including tactical and strategic level counterintelligence assignments, as well as political and military posts and diplomatic assignments. And last but not least, he is also an alumnus of our MA program at KU. So please join me in welcoming them both to the stage and to Kansas City.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Evan, for the introduction, and thank you, Eric, as well, and a rock chalk to you, Eric, as well. Go KU. Okay, that's good. And especially thanks to all of you, one, for your interest in our broader world and international affairs, but certainly for your interest in what is going on now in Ukraine. We're very honored to have Ambassador Herbst with us today, and I look forward to certainly our discussion. And the way we're going to do this, I'll spend a little time sort of having a conversation with Ambassador Herbst here. I have a number of questions. And then we'll turn it over to you, the audience, for your questions as well. So without further ado, since you don't want to hear me talk, we want to hear Ambassador Herbst talk, let me go ahead and get this rolling. And what I want to start with, sir, is noting that you were in Kiev last week, at the time of the first anniversary of Russia's invasion. Based on what you saw and the conversations you had, I'm wondering if you share some of the impressions you came away with and kind of what your assessment is of the situation right now.
Sure. I was there. I arrived in Kiev on Wednesday evening. As you know, President Biden was there on Monday, and I left Ukraine on Saturday morning. So I was there for 2.5 days. And I met with, actually I was part of a larger group that I brought with me, 2 former ambassadors, and we met with senior Ukrainian officials, including the Speaker of their Rada, the equivalent of Kevin McCarthy. We met with the Chief of Military Intelligence, General Budanov. We met with 2 deputy prime ministers. One was responsible for foreign policy, one responsible for infrastructure and reconstruction following Ukraine's victory in this war. Anyway, bottom line, they were still very happy about the visit of President Biden. They saw that as a sign of increasing American support. The Ukrainian public was delighted to see him on the streets of Kiev, just like them. But the people responsible for policy, and also other very smart Ukrainians, were saying this is wonderful, he visited, but frankly, given the state of the war, we need more American support. And by more support, they didn't mean more in the way of dollars. The amount of assistance we're providing is substantial. They're talking about more sophisticated weapons. And frankly, they're absolutely right. in that request.
So along those lines then, while it's certainly noted that it was a very positive event that President Biden made his visit to Kyiv, you and your colleagues have written very positively also about U.S. leadership in bringing this large coalition together of allies and partners in support of Ukraine. But nonetheless, as you hinted in your comments, you've been a bit critical of the administration's reticence to provide more support. So I guess the basic question is, what more does the U.S. need to do? And sort of in a related line, what more should the Europeans be doing as well?
There has been substantial aid for Ukraine, not just from the United States, but from the European Union, a collection of nearly 30 countries, and other important allies and partners, Great Britain foremost among that other group, but Japan, North Korea, Australia too. And let's understand, this is not a gift to Ukraine. This is a smart investment in American security, and for that matter, the security of Europe. I credit the Biden administration for seeing the problem. They saw it early. They began to work on it in the fall of 2021, and for helping pull together our NATO allies, partners like the European Union and others, to explain to the Kremlin what would happen if they launched this large new invasion. Keep in mind, the war's been going on now for 9 years. And the large invasion was decided because the Russians were not achieving their aims with the lower grade war, the hybrid war that they were conducting since 2014. Anyway, so the thrust of the policy which the White House put together is sound. It was serious military support for Ukraine if Moscow invades with this large force, which it has. Major sanctions on Russia, again, if there's a big invasion. And 3, strengthening substantially NATO's force posture in the east of Europe along the Russian border. The right policy framework, without a doubt, put together with skill. But, and here's where I come directly to your question, the way they've implemented this policy has been timid. That's the word I use publicly. Privately, when I get mad, I use a bit stronger language. Slow. And therefore, the overall policy is adequate. It's adequate because we have prevented Russia subduing Ukraine. Very important, very important. But only adequate because by doing it as slowly as we have, we A, increase the odds of a Kremlin victory, and B, for sure, increase the cost of even eventual Ukrainian victory. More people are dying, first and foremost Ukrainians and Russians, but more economic pain, not just for Ukraine, not just for Russia, but for Europe, for the United States, and for the global South. So what does this mean, precisely? Right now, there is essentially a standoff on the battlefield. Moscow launched a big invasion a year ago. They made substantial gains, albeit not the key gains of taking any major Ukrainian city, except Herbst, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and especially not Kyiv, not toppling the government. And that was failure number 1. Moscow in early April decided, okay, for the moment we're going to drop our aim of trying to take Kyiv, the capital, Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, located just 50 miles from the Russian border, so in a sense it should have been easy. Chernihiv, the largest city in the north of Ukraine. And they said we're going to regroup in the east in the area called Donbass, where they already established 2 little statelets before, statelets which they recognized as independent, preposterously, but they did it. And they were going to then push from there further west to take all of the Donbass region. And they began to do this. But the Ukrainians were able to stop them, and with the support of more advanced weapons that we provided at the time. The HIMARS, you've probably all heard of HIMARS. No one heard of HIMARS a year ago. We now all know HIMARS. With a range of 85 kilometers, the Ukrainians stopped that new offensive and began a counteroffensive that enabled them to take back 50% of the territory that Moscow had seized, starting with the big invasion in February. But the problem with the administration policy was evident in this time. The Ukrainians have been asking since February of last year, first for Stingers, which are anti-air rockets which can shoot things down very effectively to a range of about 3,000 meters, 10,000 feet. We were slow getting them to Ukraine. They asked us for anti-ship missiles, which we refused to provide for months and months until the Brits provided some. Then we were embarrassed and we sent them. They needed that to deal with the the rockets arriving in Ukraine for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and also to reduce the possibility of a Russian amphibious operation to take the town of Odessa, the major seaport in Ukraine. They were screaming for long range, longer than 40-kilometer range artillery from us, starting in middle of March, and we were saying no. And without that artillery, the Russians were making serious gains in that second offensive, one to take all of Donbass. Ukraine was taking serious casualties. Finally, in late May, we decided, okay, we could send the HIMARS with a range of 85 kilometers. They arrive in Ukraine end of June, early July. Immediately, the Russian offensive stops. Immediately. And within 4 or 5 weeks, the Ukrainian counteroffensive began. So, the Ukrainians are busy taking back territory, first in the north, in Donbass, but then, in October, they take the one major town that Moscow conquered in the first wave of their invasion, which was Herbst. So Moscow is reeling on the battlefield. And what do? What's the dictator to do? They decide, since their army is not competent, they will use their artillery, their rockets, their air force to bombard Ukrainian infrastructure and Ukrainian civilians. This has been partly successful. They have destroyed 50% of Ukraine's energy production. The idea was to freeze them out this winter. Well, it's now March 1. The Ukrainians consider March 1 the beginning of spring. We Americans choose to say it's a little bit later, after the vernal equinox. In any case, the vernal equinox. Yes. And they survived the winter, but without 50% of their energy. So what do we need right now to answer precisely the question you asked? The Ukrainians are asking for artillery or rockets with a range larger than 85 kilometers. We have a missile called the ATACMS, which can go 300 kilometers. We can outfit the HIMARS with other systems, which would also give them a range of 300 kilometers. The Russians are conducting this offensive in the east right now. They've been trying for 4 months to take the town of Bakhmut. Bakhmut, we never heard of Bakhmut, right? Until 3 or 4 months ago. They've made millimeter-a-day progress towards Bakhmut. Putin, by the way, said the middle of December was the date they had to take Bakhmut by. Well, here we are in March. It hasn't happened. The Ukrainians are taking serious casualties, although not as large as Russian casualties. The Russians have their supply depots located 100 kilometers behind the front line. Now, why do you think that is? Because the HIMARS can only shoot 85 kilometers. If we gave the Ukrainians HIMARS with a range of even 150 kilometers, or better yet 300, or better yet the ATACMS, that offensive would stop like that. One artillery round hits their supply depot, the Russians move all their supplies way back, which stops the offensive and complicates their ability to conduct any military operations in Ukraine. Okay. The Ukrainians want that first and foremost. And we're saying no. And then we say no. And then we say no. They also want F-16s and other advanced Western aircraft. Now, you don't have to worry that if we give Ukraine F-16s, our military will be out of F-16s. We are retiring them by the thousands, literally. We're going for F-35s. The administration, no, Ukraine doesn't need them. Yes, they do need them. They're also asking for more tanks. We made a decision to send tanks, and we only made that decision because we were embarrassed by the Brits and the Poles. We made that decision about a month ago, a little bit more than a month ago. But we decided to send them, as my mom used to say, by a slow boat to China. So they will arrive in December next year, as opposed to the spring or summer in which they could have real impact on the ground. If we gave Ukraine all of these things in a timely fashion, tanks, F-16s, and the long-range artillery and rockets, they would be able to launch a successful counteroffensive in the south that would break something called the land bridge to Crimea. Now, what is the land bridge to Crimea? Russia has, as a result of the invasion from last February, conquered all the southern coasts of Ukraine on the Sea of Azov, near Donbass. Actually, part of that coast is in Donbass. But they didn't control the coast until they seized Mariupol in, I don't remember what it was. It took them a long time. In the late summer, early fall, whatever it was. And they send supplies to Crimea, which they seized and annexed 9 years ago, partly by this bridge over the Straits of Kerch, which the Ukrainians bombed 6 or 8 months ago, but much more via the land they control, which comes from Russia through Donbass all the way to Crimea. With the equipment that I've just described, the Ukrainian counteroffensive would certainly break that land bridge this year. That means that all Russian military troops in the south of Ukraine would have to retreat into Crimea, because they would risk being surrounded by Ukrainian forces, and also because they'd have no supplies. The Russians would also have a really hard time supplying all of their troops in Crimea and their civilian administration there. Crimea would begin to wither on the vine without Ukrainian forces having to cross the very small isthmus that connects mainland Ukraine with Crimea. This would also be a huge political defeat for Putin in Russia, with political consequences. Our timidity in sending this equipment now is delaying the only reasonable end to this war, which is the Ukrainian victory. Now, if you want, I can explain why the timidity, but you have the questions. I can also hold that for later.
Okay. Perhaps my question will elicit something on that. You have written, and many others have written too, well, this timidity has been linked to fear of crossing Russian red lines, crossing Putin's red lines. And certainly you and others have expressed some disagreement with that and sort of written that off. But what I'm wondering is, you bring up Crimea, and you bring up a Ukrainian threat to Crimea. It's an ironic thing to say, since it's Ukrainian territory anyway, but a threat to Russia's hold on Crimea. And you mentioned that the loss of Crimea would have serious political consequences for Putin. Is it possible that that's where the red line's going to be for Putin, and he might react in ways that we might not like?
Well, his behavior over the last 9 years, we don't like. And his behavior goes beyond the fact that we don't like it to massive war crimes, including, some genocide scholars say, the crime of genocide. And we can talk about that if you want. Here's my take on the nuclear issue in this crisis. The United States is the world's preeminent power. In all areas of power, we dominate. It is true that Russia and the United States are roughly comparable when it comes to nuclear weapons. We were in a similar situation for decades with a more powerful enemy, the Soviet Union. We have a long practice of nuclear deterrence and a literature to match it that exists for 60 years. Actually, more than 60 years, 70 years. This practice, as conducted by a superpower, which, let's remember, we are a superpower, did not include saying publicly, every 3 days, we can't do X because we're afraid of nuclear war. We've stood up against the Soviets twice over Berlin in the late 40s and in 1961, once over Cuba, and not once did an American statesman say, oh my God, they've got nukes, we can't do this. This is not superpower behavior. That's one. That can be crystallized in the phrase, we've got nukes too. Point two, we have critical interests on the line in this war. Because Putin has said, other Russian officials have said, the 2 draft treaties that Moscow sent to Washington and to NATO in Brussels in December of 2021 said, hey, we would like to have substantial political control over all the states that used to make up the former Soviet Union. That includes 3 NATO allies, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They also, those treaties, those draft treaties, which of course were nonsense, also said, and we think we should have a veto over the defense policy of those countries that used to belong to the Warsaw Pact, another bunch of NATO nations. So Putin wins in Ukraine, he will have won because we have been intimidated. And we then have a serious problem as to what he might do next with NATO. Now let's come back specifically to your question on Crimea. The Russians have been playing nuclear poker to our disadvantage since this big invasion. They have laid down numerous red lines. For example, if Ukraine continues its successful counteroffensive in 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine, an oblast is like a state or a county here in the United States, which the Russians annexed at the end of the end of September, in the midst of Ukraine's counteroffensive. We will use all means of national power to defend sovereign Russian territory. Well, the Ukrainians continue their counteroffensive. I've yet to see a nuclear explosion. They've said the same about Crimea, by the way, since the big invasion began. And we know the Ukrainians have, not massively, but with serious impact, conducted military operations against Crimea. They partly blew up the Straits of Kerch Bridge. They blew up the Moskva, the flagship of the Ukrainian Navy, in port in Crimean territorial waters, Ukrainian territorial waters, which Russia claims are its own. When Sweden and Finland, 2 countries that have been neutral forever, said, wow, look what Russia's doing in Ukraine, we want to join NATO, they said, this is a red line. Well, progress has been made. The red line has not been crossed. So is Crimea the real red line? I cannot tell you for certain that it's not. And a smart policy will be thinking hard about all of these things privately. But the reason I suspect it's not is because, first of all, again, we've already seen at least a partial crossing of the red line. 2, there have been Kremlin-approved analysts who have said, we're only going to use nukes if our enemies attack Russia, meaning what's really Russia, not what we claim as Russia, and they seek to topple our state. A former 3-star Russian general, Yevgeny Brzezinski, said this on Russian television, the propaganda channels. And a former FSB is a Russian intelligence agency, analyst, a guy named Dmitry Trenin, wrote an article about this just 2.5 months ago. Now, they didn't specifically raise Crimea, but they were explaining why Russia's nuclear threats were not working. Because they said, and I wish what they said was true, is because the West knows this is just a bluff. Well, the Biden administration has not gotten that message, which is unfortunate for American interests. They don't want to commit nuclear suicide.
Sure.
Oh, and also, very important, they have threatened the use of tactical nukes in Ukraine. They can use them, but that would have very little impact on the battlefield. They will certainly make an area of, I don't know, 8, 10, 15 square miles uninhabitable for a while, and they will destroy whatever Ukrainian military formations are there. But the Ukrainian military lineup is not based on heavily concentrated Ukrainian troops. And besides, they'll really annoy, really make us angry or unhappy at that point.
Sure.
And maybe even the Chinese. They're quasi-partners.
Well, although they haven't used nuclear weapons yet, and we're all happy about that, we've seen quite a lot of horrendous things that have happened in Ukraine.
Correct.
At the hands of the Russian armed forces, which in some ways seem to be the large rapacious mob that we've come used to.
Well, they're really effective at dealing with women and children and old men. It's the Ukrainian military where they have problems.
They have problems with that. So, which gets us to the issue of war crimes. I mean, the Europeans are looking at setting up some sort of investigating body of tribunal. The Ukrainians are collecting information. I see the OSCE's been collecting information. Everyone's collecting the information to use. But I'm wondering, realistically, what do you see as the prospects that, say, the leadership of the Russian military or even the political leadership will face consequences for these war crimes?
This is also another good question. There are serious efforts in Ukraine, you mentioned in Europe, also here, to document Russian war crimes, which are being conducted on an industrial scale and intentionally, and if you want, I can go through that. So there's some serious evidence, and some people point out this is the first time in history that we're collecting war crime evidence on a almost immediate basis, right? All those Russian war crimes in Bucha took place in late February and early to mid-late March. And as soon as the Ukrainians took Bucha back, which was in early April, people went in to begin collecting the evidence. So we're seeing it collected on a serious basis. So the clear ground zero for war crimes in Ukraine right now is Mariupol, which of course is still under Russian control. I think these efforts are smart and laudable, which is not directly answering your question. I see them as useful, or not just useful, but very important for job one, which is making sure Moscow loses its war. Because this is creating a certain amount of anxiety in Russia, which has actually appeared on the Russian propaganda channels on TV. And so it's weakening, I think, the will to continue this war. Whether it's actually possible to bring Russian war criminals to justice is a question, in my mind. I would like to see it. But to my mind, if we could administer a major defeat to Russian aggression, have Ukraine take back its territory, that's good enough for me. But it's possible that even the leadership can be brought to account, because we don't know what changes will unfold in Russia after they lose the war. There will be serious changes over time, maybe dramatic, immediate, including a new government which is willing to acknowledge that war crimes were committed, and there are therefore even high-level Russian war criminals who need to face justice. But I would say that's not impossible, but certainly on the unlikely side.
And I think as we look at the possibility of war crimes or other international responses, say through the UN or elsewhere, and I'm going to kind of glom a couple of things together here. It will require certain countries to make decisions on how they're going to deal with the situation. I'm going to specifically bring up the Chinese, since they're in the news lately because of their, well, so-called peace proposal, which is not really a peace proposal, it's a series of talking points on a document. And of course, Russian President Lukashenko is paying a visit there right now. And the others are the Indians, who are assiduously straddling the fence on this one right now. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the Chinese and the Indians and how they might play into either resolving or prolonging this situation.
Well, I would have to say that China has been largely, not entirely, or not somewhat helpful to Russia in this war. First, the major communique that Xi and Putin issued in early February of last year before the invasion about their partnership certainly bucked up Putin as he was about to go into Ukraine. And of course, China, while saying it supports territorial integrity, never talks about the Russian seizure of Crimea or other parts of Ukraine. And the thrust of Chinese media operations has been almost wholly supportive of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, so that's from the standpoint of Moscow, the positive side. Then the not quite positive side, but maybe good enough for government work side, is China has been buying Russian oil. Gas is harder because there's not a pipeline. And in that sense, supporting the Russian economy. But the Chinese have not been doing Russia any real favor because they're buying them at reduced prices. So they're taking some economic advantage of Moscow. And now you have, and then another thing which is actually, well, we're still talking about this quasi-positive stuff. Now you have the Chinese peace plan, in quotes, which is largely favorable to the Kremlin. Largely favorable because while it bows towards territorial integrity, it doesn't define it in this case. And it leans sharply in favor of a ceasefire. And a ceasefire in place would be a gift to Putin, whose military, especially even without the more weapons coming from the US I was just advocating, are probably going to face some hard times come spring and summer. There will be a Ukrainian counteroffensive, which will make some progress. It would make a lot more if we did the smart thing. So a ceasefire favors the Kremlin. So that's where China's been helpful, sort of, to Moscow. But on the other side of the ledger, one piece, the Chinese chastise the Russians, Putin specifically, for the nuclear games. Because what Moscow is doing with nuclear weapons, the whole game, basically says to the entire world, you want to have nukes to avoid a situation like this. Remember, Ukraine gave up its nukes because it had not guarantees but assurances from us, Russia, the Brits, the French, even the Chinese, that they would be safe. Well, those assurances turned out to be, bupkis. But now the Russian threats to use nuclear again highlights the advantage of being a nuclear power. So the Chinese didn't like that because it doesn't fit with their overall nuclear policy. Bottom line, I don't think, there are also stories now about China sending weapons to Russia. Tony Blinken sent them a very clear warning. I think what the administration has done on this has been very smart. It's just like what they did before the big invasion, where for 3 months they would telegraph every Russian move, therefore putting the Russians off balance. And I think they're doing that now with the Chinese. I don't think the Chinese will send weapons because they really don't want American sanctions, and they don't want to truly damage relations with the US over this. Maybe over other things, but not over this. Okay, so that's China. India. India has been a de facto ally of Moscow going back 60 plus years. Going back to Nehru, right, the great Indian leader of the 50s and the early 60s. And that continues to this day. Since I am not a big fan of Bush the Younger's foreign policy, I think it was by and large dreadful. His father was a master. The son got it wrong. But the one really good thing that the younger Bush did was start in a serious way to court India with some success. And that was largely followed by both Obama and Trump. And the relationship has gotten better over the past 15 or so years. We were beginning to loosen that Indian-Russian relationship, which has existed literally for over half a century. But now, and actually, the Russians were seeing this, and the Russians were playing the BRIC game. BRIC meaning the organization of Brazil, Russia, India, China. Now it's BRICS with South Africa. Putting that together as a counterpoise to Western power. And India liked that idea. And then with the big invasion, Moscow was assiduous to make sure India in no way crossed them. And here we've seen India play a game similar to China. Yes, India more than China, India voted against Russia in the UN General Assembly, which is sort of like the least common thing you could do to demonstrate your outrage about blatant aggression. But has not gone along on sanctions, has been a place that, like China, buys oil at cut rates. And both India and China might be playing games with helping Russia get around sanctions. And we are starting to look more closely at this, and not just those two countries, by the way. And we're trying desperately to, even in this crisis, to wean India further from Moscow, but without any real success. But India, like China, sent Putin a warning about stop playing games with nukes.
All right. Well, Ambassador Herbst, I've got a bunch of really fantastic questions here that I'd love to use. I spent a lot of time working on them today. However, what I'd like to do now is open up the floor to our audience for some questions here. So if you have a question, I guess if you just come up, sort of queue up by the microphones, and I will do my best to get through as many as we possibly can. Sir, we'll start over here with you.
It's a two-part question, basically the same question. If you were to represent the positive side of what you call the timid policy of the United States towards the Ukraine reaction to Russia, what would those arguments be? And what are the reasons why they are not taking the aggressive position that you would recommend?
Okay. First, let me point out that what I'm advocating, if you consider that to be aggressive, then I would assume you would say, for example, our launching of the battle of our taking the campaign to Hitler and Tojo during World War II is aggressive. I think that strong action defending countries from aggression is not aggressive action. It's strong, wise action. Now, having made that point, the positive side I've mentioned. They did a brilliant job before the Russian invasion declassifying our intelligence to make it impossible for Putin to sell his coming aggression as a response to some supposed Ukrainian provocation. That was brilliant. Also brilliant was our intelligence agency's correct prediction of what Russia would do in a whole host of ways. But our intelligence agencies were equally bad in predicting what Ukraine would do. Now, the most important thing the administration has done, I already said, they saw the problem coming, they laid out the right basket of policies, they built up a coalition to stop it, and they've done enough to make sure Putin could not succeed. So an adequate policy in response to a major challenge is praiseworthy, but not praiseworthy enough for the reasons that I've already described. And again, the principal reason for this is they've been spooked by the gigantic Putin-Con game on nukes. And in being spooked, they have ignored the very strong record of American foreign policy during the Cold War. And I don't get that. Biden was a foreign policy, I won't say master, but a strong foreign policy actor for his years, all of his years in the Senate. He was good on Ukraine when Obama was weak on sending javelins to Ukraine. But his foreign policy team is not A grade. It's not even quite B grade. For all of his peculiarities on Russia and Ukraine, Trump had a much stronger national security team.
Mr. Herbst,
Sir.
thank you for being here. What do you consider mistakes that the U.S. has made in regard to our relations with Russia? And I am thinking of our nuclear weapons that we have in Germany, Belgium, Holland, Italy, and Turkey. And another thing is that we do these war games or war exercises in Poland. We do things with the Baltic countries. To me, this is like playing with dynamite around a campfire. And also, were you the ambassador in the Trump administration or the Biden administration? When you were introduced, they didn't say anything.
I was ambassador under Clinton, briefly in Uzbekistan, and then under Bush in both Uzbekistan and Ukraine. But I was nominated by Clinton for one and by Biden for the other. I mean, not Biden, by Bush for the other.
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
would you say problems with American policy on Russia? First,
Yeah,
I'll
what
answer that.
mistakes do you think we have made?
Right.
Yes.
First, I'll answer that question directly, then I'll respond to the implicit part of your question. The mistakes in our policy towards Russia was not realizing how aggressive Putin's foreign policy is and how we needed to stop him with strong action, going back not just to the start of his war in Ukraine in 2014, but to his war on Georgia in 2008. Now,
you meant
implicit
Crimea, didn't you, in 2014?
They began their war on Ukraine by seizing Crimea in 2014.
Okay.
But you talk about America's nuclear presence in Europe.
Like the Cuban missile, you know, the proximity.
Correct, I understand.
Yeah.
We have built up our military in Europe, conventional and nuclear, as a deterrent against a dangerous adversary. During the Cold War, especially in the early days of the Cold War, in the 50s, the Russians or the Soviets had a much stronger conventional military in Europe than we did. So the nukes were essential to make sure that Russia did not invade Europe. We actually, at the end of the Cold War, substantially reduced our military presence, including nuclear, in Europe. And only over the past now it goes back to 2016, late Obama, did we begin to send more military forces to Europe because we saw Putin's policy becoming more dangerous. But we were a little bit late in doing that. But now our posture in Europe is pretty good. And again, our policy in defense of Ukraine, to defend our interests, is at least okay, which it wasn't under Obama. But we can do better. And I think we will do better. It's a funny thing. We say no, no, no to weapons, and then we say yes. So our policy constantly ratchets up in the right direction, just not as quickly as it should. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, please.
Russia has been bled.
Has been what?
Bled. You know, they've used a lot of materials. Janet Yellen was on TV the other day. She said the Russians lost a lot of tanks. Their factories to replace them are not working because of the sanctions. They can't get essential parts. Anyway, with Russia being revealed to be rather weak, is there any possibility China might say, hey, there's a whole bunch of Mongolia that was ours for a long time. Might they have an interest in going after Russia?
China first. Well, let me say something I haven't said tonight. I've said for a decade that our long-term adversary is China, because China is clearly stronger than Russia in all ways except for nuclear power, nuclear weapons. But our short-range danger is Russia, because Putin takes risks that Xi does not take. Although Xi's taking more and more risks, and that's a separate issue. China's eyes are not on Mongolia, they're on Taiwan. And you can be sure, if as a result of our not as strong as it should be policy, Putin were to win in Ukraine, the chances of Xi grabbing Taiwan go way up. There are some people who don't understand international relations who say that by spending our energy and our weapons on Ukraine, we're increasing the risk of Xi grabbing Taiwan. No, nonsense. The Chinese have been appalled by how poorly the Russians have done, and they're wondering if 30-year-old American technology like HIMARS can do that to the Russians. What could the most sophisticated American technology do to us, the Chinese I'm referring to, around Taiwan?
All right, thank you. Sir.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you. President Zelensky has made a remarkable, or at least a very public anti-corruption campaign right in the middle of an existential war. Could you describe the kind of the trajectory of this war on corruption and what you see as a marker for success?
Corruption remains a large problem in Ukraine, and after Mr. Putin, the second largest danger to the country. Under Zelensky, during his first 9 or 10 months in office, just as under his predecessor in the first 9 or 10 months in office, there were significant steps taken to battle corruption. And in both cases, after those 9 or 10 months, you might say vested interest resumed, found a new balance, and the progress more or less stopped or began to come in small steps as opposed to larger steps. The war has focused everyone's attention in Ukraine and outside on the war, I mean the big Russian invasion, as opposed to corruption. But it's also made it much more dangerous for anyone in Ukraine to engage, because willingness or acquiescence in corruption has largely disappeared. So that's a real positive. But the problem remains, and I suspect it will only be addressed in a decisive way once Ukraine wins and they begin a reconstruction process, which involves hundreds, if not thousands, of Westerners looking closely at everything going on in the economy, but also at the same time, they begin accession talks, or rather they deepen accession talks to become members of the EU. And likewise, you have all these EU bureaucrats demanding X and Y and Z. And then corruption will be decisively defeated. But it remains something we have to watch for. By the way, very important. The know-nothings who think there are no American interests in Ukraine, and therefore we should let Russia conquer Ukraine, talk about American assistance winding up in expense accounts, in bank accounts for corrupt people. There is no evidence of that at the present time. And we do have a rigorous monitoring system. It doesn't mean there may not be problems with it, exceptions to it. And the Ukrainians have said they would welcome any new requirements that, for example, the US Congress wants to impose. So, please, let's impose more. But don't use that as an excuse to avoid steps that are essential to ensure our own well-being, which is what the know-nothings are proposing.
All right. Thank you, sir. Sir.
Ambassador, thank you for being here. I heard mention of the Jayhawks. I prefer to talk Tiger, but
You prefer what?
we'll let it go. We'll let it go tonight. I need to ask you, President Trump in 2019, he announced a new branch of military, the Space Force. Those smarter technologies that military branch, granted it's not directly involved in this current conflict, but are we proving that those smarter technologies can reduce civilian casualties in these conflict areas?
Well, I mean, smart technologies are great for efficiency. So they can be used for good or ill depending upon the motivation of the user, right? So clearly, Moscow has been trying as best it can to wreak havoc in Ukraine with a fair amount of success. And they have some smart bombs, and those smart bombs have been used to to real disadvantage for civilians and infrastructure and occasionally military in Ukraine. But thank God they don't have nearly our capacity with technology, both military and civilian. And this has proved a real disadvantage for them. And again, even our old technology is proving damn useful and effective in Ukraine.
All right, thank you. Sir.
Two-part question. One on the nuclear aspect.
Right.
How exactly was Ukraine ever foolish enough to give up its nuclear arsenal? Was that based on just purely verbal assurances from the West, or was there any sort of written or contractual obligations or anything done from the United States or other Western nuclear powers? And number two, on Crimea, how is it that they have not been able to destroy the man-made bridges that go out to Crimea?
Okay. On the disarmament of Ukraine, they were pushed very hard by all major actors in the global community to give up their nukes. And they weren't the only ones. Belarus and Kazakhstan also gave up nukes. And the thinking was, and this thinking is sound, the more countries that have nukes, the more dangerous, the more likely that there might be some sort of nuclear disaster or use of nuclear weapons. And so the US was first and foremost among those pushing Ukraine to give it up. And I have a friend who is heavily engaged in that. As he pointed out, if Ukraine had not done that, we would not have provided all sorts of assistance that they needed. And our support for Ukraine joining the UN, actually they were already a member of the UN, joining all the other necessary international organizations would have not happened. I'm not going to tell you it was a mistake at that time, although I understand why people say it was. The mistake was we refused to give real guarantees, we gave only assurances. Maybe had we given real guarantees like our commitment to do whatever it takes to ensure Ukraine's territorial integrity was ensured, maybe that would have prevented a Russian attack on Ukraine 9 years ago. As for Crimea and the bridge, your question's a great one. I've asked it myself many times. I don't know if the Ukrainians have been reluctant not to take that second step. I don't know if they were advised not to do that. I don't know if they didn't have they had a good one-off and they don't have the capacity to do it again with some assurance. It could be any of those three. It is true, if we gave them ATACMS and they advance and take the Azov Sea coast back from Russia, they'd be able to take it out, in which case the Russians would only be able to resupply Crimea by ferry.
All right, thank you. I'm going to, as we say in diplomacy, I will close my speakers list with those who are up here right now because we don't want to overstay our welcome for our kind hosts. So please, sir.
Hi. Do you think that real peace, like an explicit permanent cessation of hostilities, can be struck in Ukraine's favor while Putin still holds power? And if not, you had mentioned that cutting the land bridge and retaking Crimea would strike severe damages to Putin's regime, and that should, in the event of a Ukrainian victory, a better, more cooperative regime arise in Russia,
Okay.
that war crimes could be convicted.
Okay. And,
How does a Ukrainian victory, how does Ukrainian advancement produce conditions conducive towards a more liberal, in the international sense, a more liberal regime, rather than elevate ultra-nationalists to controlling Russia's nuclear arsenal?
Another good question. You guys specialize in good questions. A lot of people ask the question, can there be a real peace if Putin's in power? I think that technically this is doable. And when I say technically, I mean if Putin were to realize that his grand adventure in Ukraine was a failure and that continuing it would be bad not just for Russia but for his rule in Russia, I think he could turn on a dime and maintain power in Russia. He could say something like, boy, did I beat up those Nazis in Ukraine. I've taught them a lesson, now I'm coming home. He can do that. The question for me is he psychologically able to do that? He has built in his own mind the notion that he's going to be one of the great Russian collectors of land. Like Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible. Actually, Ivan III was the greatest, the Russian collector of lands. So can he walk away from it? Many people say no. I think they're probably right, but who knows? Stranger things have happened. Now, if, say, the offensive I've described takes place and successful, and Crimea becomes harder and harder for Russia to hold, and eventually a decision is taken in Moscow, with or without Putin, to give up Crimea. Is that possible? Absolutely. There's actually an historic pattern in Russia that when they have a nasty war abroad, which means a war that they lose, there's a period of the loosening of central power and even a liberalization of kinds. This happened after the Crimean War in the mid-19th century, after the Russo-Japanese War in early 20th century, after World War I, and you can even throw in World War II, excuse me, the Cold War, meaning the collapse of the Soviet Union as a fourth example. An amazing thing, and this is important to know, that my colleagues, experts on Russia, who've been consistently on the wrong side of this issue going back to 2014, say is, it's Putin or Neanderthal. Baloney. They ignore the history of Russia that I just laid out for you. I'm not saying there can't be a post-Putin Neanderthal in the wake of a Ukrainian victory, but the historical record points in the other direction, as does the following fact. Putin's big invasion of Ukraine is a made-in-Putin's-mind invasion. We know that almost no one, including in his inner circle, were brought in on this decision. If you look at those very strange videotapes of Putin's meeting with his closest advisors 3 days before the invasion, or Putin meeting with his defense minister and #1 soldier a day or two after the invasion, they all look appalled. And they had reason to be appalled, even before. Because given the policy that Biden outlined, it was clear Moscow was going to take huge hits, no matter what its forces did in Ukraine.
Thank you. Ma'am.
Okay, my question is, so Putin's objective was to begin with Ukraine, or actually he began in Georgia, but to, like you said, and just mentioned, is to recover all the lands that they had under the USSR or whatever, yes. Right. So what is the impact of this war and their obvious incompetency, the fact that their military has been shown to the world to be, really a straw man, easily shot down. So you've got Belarus, which Lukashenko is just his puppet, but there's a strong national, support for them, and the fact that just a few days ago or last week they had local Belarusians who attacked the special plane. I can't remember what the name of it was. You've got Georgia, which was invaded before. You've got Armenia and Azerbaijan, which are now conflict because Russia is kind of like focusing on Ukraine, but that was his area of that he wanted to control. And then, like you said, you've got the Balkans, which are now in NATO. So this really blow up, this failure that he's having in Ukraine, that is kind of blowing up his whole plan. So what is the impact on Belarus and Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia, all this area that was his plan to get back?
Okay, great question. We've already seen a notable weakening of Russian influence across all the states that used to be part of the Soviet Union. When there was a conference of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Uzbekistan in, I think it was November, there were pictures of Putin waiting for his Central Asian interlocutor to show up for meetings. So that's a small example. We've seen the Armenians say no to the Russians in connection with the war in Ukraine. We've seen Kazakhstan do the same thing. And this just a year, months after Russian-led troops helped quell some disturbances in Kazakhstan in January of 2022. So Moscow's position throughout the area has weakened as a result of this war. And when Ukraine wins, and that will happen again if our support does not diminish, it doesn't have to increase, but at least it doesn't diminish, Russian influence will be much further reduced. And this will be a good thing throughout that region.
Can I interject real quickly with a question online, and then we'll finish up with this one? Somebody asked specifically about Elon Musk's shifting support of the war, but I wonder if you could maybe speak generally about private sector support for Ukraine.
Okay. I would have to say that Musk was a real hero in the first months after the big invasion. The Starlink system was really important for Ukraine to maintain communications in the light of the Russian offensive, both on the civilian and the military side. Musk is a business genius, and being a business genius, he probably thinks he's a plain old genius, meaning that he can comment without knowledge on all sorts of questions, even complex ones. I'm not certain why his commentary has taken the turn we've seen over the past 6 or 7 months, maybe even a little bit longer than that. He may have doubled down because the Ukrainians have been relentless in pushing back against stupid ideas which might endanger their security if they gain momentum. It may have been a tactical mistake for them to do that with Musk, because he clearly is a sensitive personality. And responding to that, that might have made him say, well, hey, how dare they do that to me? But I think we're dealing more with, again, the privileged thinkings of a genius not recognize the limits of his own genius. But on balance, you look at his role in this, it's been a positive because of what he did at the beginning in the most dangerous moments.
I have 2 questions. One is about the Russian soldiers themselves. Where are the Russians getting the manpower and the military equipment and everything for them to continue to fight the war? And do you see this turning into a psychological operations or proxy war in the United States?
Well, there are actually many questions in that one question. All of them need to be addressed. First, on Russian soldiers. You know, Putin is trying to sell the snake oil to his own people that this is an existential war for Russia. Now, World War II was an existential war for Russia. During World War II, we were not reading about hundreds of thousands of draft-age Russian men fleeing the country. They were marching to the sounds of the guns, not away as fast as they could. And you know that because of the savage, not just for Ukrainians, but for Russian soldiers, tactics of the Russian military in Ukraine, they were running out of men last fall, which is why they launched this partial mobilization. That partial mobilization was a political failure for Putin. You didn't just have people running away. You had criticism of the mobilization, including from regime figures, because they knew how unpopular it was among the Russian population, including, very importantly, in major cities across Russia. The overwhelming number, and I don't have the percentages, but the overwhelming number of Russian soldiers who fought and died in Ukraine come from either poor rural regions of Russia or from the non-Russian regions. But with this mobilization, they were pulling Russians from populated Russian regions.
Not to interrupt or anything, but have there been confirmations of rumors of private military contractors or mercenaries being used?
Oh, this is not private. These are not rumors. The Wagner Group, mercenaries, have been a major part of the fighting.
So those are the Z guys, right?
Yes, although Z has become a symbol of Russian strength or Russian stupidity, really, throughout this crisis. But the Russians are having problems now mobilizing people because those guys are dying by the droves, and they're using kamikaze tactics to seize millimeters of land around Bakhmut. And there's major griping in the ultra-nationalist Russian community on the Russian equivalent of Twitter, which I follow because they will give you real criticism of what's happening on the battlefield, which you obviously don't get from the Russian media. And the Wagner chief, Prigozhin, is fighting with the defense minister and the chief general, Gerasimov, over the war. And there's all signs of rats fighting, brawling on the deck of the ship because the ship's going in the wrong direction. So this all means that what we're seeing here is having, and eventually may have decisive consequences within Russia. Now, is there any part of your question I haven't answered?
Yeah, pretty much. So you could actually say that the Russian army is almost on the verge of mutiny?
I wouldn't say that. I just don't know. We just don't know. But I would not rule out something like that over time, or a simple implosion of Russian military resistance to Ukrainian forces in Ukraine. That could happen. It would happen faster, again, if we had a bolder, stronger, smarter policy.
Okay. Right. And ma'am, our last question for the evening.
So given the ineptitude of the Russian forces and the awful repair of their equipment, is there a possibility that Russia's nuclear arsenal is in a similar state of disrepair? That's my first question. And the second one is, should the United States government or whoever be doing more to thwart the Russian psyops and disinformation campaign in this country that leads to, I don't know, crazy statements in social media?
Okay.
Thanks.
On Russia's nuclear capacity, it's a good question, which also our own government has been asking and trying to figure out. Putin had a bad week last week. And one part of that bad week relates directly to your question. In order to show his nuclear toughness, 2 hours before Biden gave his address in Warsaw, the Russians conducted an intercontinental ballistic missile test. The problem was it went kaput, it went poof, which again speaks to your question. Now, on PSYOPs, Moscow has been pretty good at PSYOPs. There's no doubt about it. I think that we've gotten a lot better. We basically were paying no attention to this 7 or 8 years ago. We began to pay some serious attention, and not just the United States, and not just governments. We've had private American citizens and private citizens in Europe paying quality attention to this. You've probably all heard of the firm Bellingcat, which has done wonderful work. My own colleagues in the Atlantic Council have done very good work on this too. Work that we started, by the way, my little center, but then it was taken away from us, so we had better things to do. But there's a specific dimension, which you alluded to, which is that, sadly, and contrary to American interests, the whole Russia-Ukrainian thing has found a place in partisan American domestic politics. So a tiny fraction of the Republican Party has kind of begun to buy some Russian narratives and spread them. Now, just before I came here, and by the way, I'm on Twitter, but I am really incompetent when it comes to social media. But I'm trying to be less incompetent. That's both a personal failure and a product of age, by the way. But Zelensky did a 2.5-hour press conference last week on the anniversary of the big invasion in Kyiv. I was there at that event, although I was doing my own media, so I was not in the room when he did this. And some let's just say, ethically challenged individual, cut and pasted from that interview and put on a clip which is now going viral. Zelensky seeming to say that American boys and girls are going to be going to die in Ukraine, in other words, fighting Russians, when he did not say that. What he said was a variant of what I said to you. Well, I actually didn't say this. I didn't get to it because you had such strong moderation. That if Putin wins in Ukraine, it'll be a disaster for us in the Baltics. What I didn't say was that would not only be very expensive for us, but it would also involve American soldiers. So he was saying that, although not as directly as I just said it to you, and that was, again, clipped in a way to suggest that he was saying American soldiers will be going to Ukraine. So this was posted on Instagram by a certain Republican congresswoman who I'll not mention. So I clipped that, and with help from one of my staff, a guy who's not technically challenged, I managed to put out a tweet showing what she posted and saying, foes of aid to Ukraine resort to using fake reasons. So this is a problem we need to do more on. But the way to handle it is to point out, again, that America's interests are on the line because we have enjoyed 74 years, 73 years? Wait a minute, my math is getting bad. 77 plus years of no great power war, largely because of NATO and our position of strength globally. You undermine NATO, we're at risk in ways that we are not without it. So we have an interest in making sure that Putin's designs come a cropper in Ukraine without any American blood. And the $55 billion a year that we're sending to Ukraine, which is both military and economic aid, represents 6% of our defense budget. And with that aid, and also not just from us, from our European allies and partners, Ukraine has destroyed up to 50% of Moscow's conventional military capability. That's a darn good investment in American security. Thank you all. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And thanks very much to all of you for coming here and for your great questions. They were better than mine. Thanks to the Kansas City Public Library and the staff for making all this happen, and also to our sponsors, too numerous to name because I've forgotten who they are. Have a wonderful evening. Rock Chalk Jayhawk.